in her eyes. On a battlefield, staring down a barrel of a 40 cal Glock or a 9. Walking toward the killer, 5 to 10 feet from a gauge. Ain't seen a front page, but lived to walk away unscathed.
Detroit means a lot to me on a personal level. My father was born here. My grandfather and my great-grandfather were both Detroiters. My great-grandfather's family was one of thousands of Southerners who came to Detroit to escape extreme poverty. They were dirt poor farmers who were barely surviving, literally. They had no choice but to move, and to them, Detroit, with its high-paying automotive jobs, was paradise. But the reality is, my grandfather came to Detroit a poor man, and he died here a poor man. It was like that for countless people in the last 100 years of Detroit's history. And right now, things are looking worse. So what really happened here?
Royce Travis was born in 1901 in the South, the second son of poor farmers. Unable to scratch out a decent living from the Tennessee soil, the Travises headed north to Detroit. That was a common story. All variations on the theme of leaving the South for the hope of better times in Detroit. Reverend Oliver remembers being raised by his grandparents. They were prospering in the South, but at that time, it was dangerous just to be African American in the South, and could be even more dangerous if you were prosperous. The Olivers, like their poor white counterparts, the Travises, also set their sights on Detroit.
Just to talk about the impact that my grandparents had on my life because they raised me. They were from the South, Mississippi, a little place called Okolona, and also Aberdeen, Amory. And they moved here in the early 40s. They owned 180 acres of farm, and some problems developed where it became the right thing for them to leave the South due to a dangerous situation that occurred in Mississippi. So they moved to Detroit.
Southerners were migrating north where the air was colder, but the opportunities were about as hot as they could be. It was Henry Ford who made it happen when he combined two irresistible ideas, an assembly line and a cheap car. Boring? Yes. Mind-numbing tedious, in fact, but hugely successful for Ford. Incredibly enough, Ford was one of the few company owners who believed in integrating his workforce. African Americans worked at Ford plants starting around 1910 and earned the same as their white counterparts. By 1926, over 10,000 African Americans worked at Ford facilities. Ford's first plant was the Highland Park plant. By 1920, it could turn out a car a minute. It was followed by the spectacular 16 million square foot River Rouge facility begun in 1917.
Behind me here is a very small part of a massive, huge facility called the River Rouge facility. It's created for Henry Ford. And this facility actually is the biggest of its kind, was in like the entire universe when it was made. And this entire waterway was actually dredged just for Henry Ford in this facility so they could actually manufacture and create their own materials to make the cars, like the steel, the glass, everything that you would use to make a car with, and created enormous amounts of jobs for people that came from all over the country, came to Detroit to work, and really put Detroit on the map.
With Ford's success and his integration policies, Detroit might have been a real fine destination for African Americans. Unfortunately, many Southern whites migrating to the Motor City brought with them the very thing African Americans prayed would be left behind: a deep racial hatred. Now, you might have thought The Northern whites, the established Detroiters, would have nothing but contempt for any white supremacist good old boy from the South. But instead, it seems as though the white majority in Detroit worked just as tirelessly as their Southern brethren to oppress African Americans.
Now, friends, I'm just an average American. But I'm an American American. And some of the things I see in this country of ours make my blood boil. I see Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you. Now I ask you, if we allow this thing to go on, what's going to become of us real Americans?
Not everyone got up on a soapbox like this guy, but there were a lot of other ways to keep African Americans oppressed, from housing segregation and police brutality to job discrimination. There was even a Klan cross burning in 1925 that drew a crowd of 10,000. If you didn't look too closely, there appeared to be some African American prosperity.
When he relocated in Detroit, he bought a house on 12th Street, which is not too far from the John C. Lodge Expressway. And he had the ability to financially develop a business in the Highland Park, which wasn't too far from the house that he had bought.
African Americans in Detroit did run small businesses, law offices, clinics, even a bank. Problem was, they were restricted to African American areas such as Paradise Alley. Most of Detroit's African American residents were poor. Many didn't have running water or heat. They were confined to the white-controlled boundaries of their ghettos, with few opportunities outside or inside. Sooner or later, things were going to turn ugly, and from ugly to deadly.
Yeah, it's the apartment advertised in a paper. Yeah, the rent's okay. A present address? Lenox Avenue, 1455. What's that? Wait a minute. You got it advertised.
African Americans found it extremely difficult to find housing.
How do you like that?
Many African Americans were forced to live in run-down apartments, often with no indoor plumbing at all. They typically paid 200 to 300% more in rent than whites. Finding decent work was also a constant uphill battle.
One, then another. Whatever they do, they're going to make hell for that first Negro girl you put on the payroll. A lot of white girls just don't want to work next to a Negro girl, whether you like it or not.
If you want to set an example, put the first Negro secretary in my office.
Nope. Not on your life, Todd. And have 12 girls quit?
It hasn't even happened yet. I tell you, I know it for a fact. I got it on the best authority.
Oh, right from the horse's mouth.
Well, go ahead, laugh. Maybe you won't think it's so funny when one of them is sitting at the desk next to you, or at your desk, maybe.
That I wouldn't wish on anybody.
No, Ella. She claims they're going to start hiring some Negro office help around here.
So what?
So if they do, I quit.
You're kidding.
Go ahead, Kit. You tell them. Me, they laugh at.
Kit, you don't mean that.
Yes, I do. Don't misunderstand me. I haven't got anything against them. Take Ned, the guard at the door, for instance. We're good friends, and I like him. But that doesn't mean that I want him or his sister working in the office with me. Girls, I don't bother them, and they don't bother me. That's the way I mean to keep it.
To make matters worse, they were often abused by the Detroit police. The police force was overwhelmingly white. In the summer of '41, gangs of white youth terrorized African American neighborhoods. In 1943, the city decided to let African Americans into a recently built housing project in a white neighborhood. That set the stage for rioting. All it took to get it started were a couple of nasty rumors.
Anybody has to admit, we've had some horrific moments in this city. The '67 riots are the ones everybody remembers. The 1943 riot was probably worse. Mobs attacking black people basically for being black, all based on the usual completely bogus rumor.
So this is the famous Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit. You know, back in 1943, there was a rumor spread among blacks that some white men took a black woman and her baby and threw her off of this bridge.
Yeah, that's a long way down, too.
Wow.
Huh. Okay, so this is a period of a lot of black-white tension.
Right.
The information I've seen from the white side is that the rumor that was spread was a black population that raped and killed a white woman on the bridge.
Really?
Yeah, so you can see that, I mean, they're both rumors, but from both sides, essentially that's what sparked the racial riot at the time.
Yeah, I would think that anything like that, any type of news like that would, you know, actually start a riot.
If you have that much tension anywhere, I mean, sparks can fly.
Right,
Yeah.
it can. Wow.
Wow.
A full-scale riot broke out. The violence lasted over a day and a half. 35 people were killed, 25 of them African American. 1,800 were arrested, the vast majority of them African American. Sometimes it's hard to see what's wrong with the city. But when there's a violent riot that rages on for 36 hours, resulting in 35 dead and almost 2,000 arrested, you know something is seriously damaged. You would think somebody got the message, somebody in the mayor's office, maybe even someone in Washington. But after the dead were buried and the rest thrown in jail, Detroit got back to work, making tanks and bombers for the Allied effort. When the war ended, Detroit went right back to what it loved the most, the car business. There was a renewed spirit of hope in America back then, a belief that anyone willing to work hard could make it. Maybe Detroit's new wealth would finally bring peace and happiness. That, of course, would depend on who got wealthy and who did not. The 1950s will always be remembered as some sort of golden era of prosperity, and for some Detroiters, it was a time of comfort and prosperity. For some. Here are some facts pulled from the 1950s golden era of Detroit. A proposed 500-unit integrated housing development is vetoed by the mayor. Police continue to abuse African Americans, and incredibly, African American and white police ride in separate cars from 1950 to 1958. Housing discrimination creates neighborhood by neighborhood segregation. White-owned hospitals regularly put African Americans in separate wards. African Americans dealt with constant underemployment and job discrimination. African American schools were underfunded. Even resorts and vacation spots were segregated. This total disregard for integration obviously had deep roots.
Oh, I don't think Mr. Candy would sell to them. Take another look. Well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get Dick on the phone right away.
You know, Detroit began as a blue-collar city, the modern Detroit. First it was stoves. This was the stove capital of the world before it was the motor capital of the world. Then it was cars, and Detroit gave hundreds of thousands of people a chance to live the middle-class dream. Now, when you live the middle-class dream, you keep aspiring. You get your first house, it's in Detroit. Hallelujah, you never thought you'd get to live this big. Holy smokes, you're making a little bit more money. You can afford a place in Warren. It's a close-in suburb. You can have your own land. You can have a little garden.
In the 1960s, the city might have integrated. The times were right for peace and harmony. Instead, whites fled Detroit for suburban pastures, taking enormous wealth and resources with them in the form of businesses, tax dollars, and consumer power, leaving a gutted town behind, wondering how bad it was going to get. Racism, unemployment, segregated neighborhoods, and now abandonment.
The city of Detroit from the 60s up until now has changed dramatically really. We had a lot of different shops, and when I grew up here on 12th Street and a lot of different areas, you had, it has a lot of urban blight here now.
Tragically, the Detroit police remained hostile to African Americans despite decades of attempts to integrate the force. In 1965, less than 3% of the force was African American, while the population itself was 50% African American. On September 12, 1965, African American kids playing outside their area were told to leave. They protested. The cops arrested them and beat them severely. There were countless other incidents. Between 1960 and 1965, over 1,000 African Americans were severely injured by police. On July 23, 1967, a Sunday, the police raided a blind pig or speakeasy on the corner of 12th Street and Claremont in downtown Detroit. The patrons fought back. The fight evolved into one of the deadliest and most destructive riots the U.S. has ever seen. It went on for over 5 days and left 43 people dead, almost 500 injured, 2,000 buildings burned down. President Johnson sent in the Army and the National Guard. Detroit has never been the same. The 1967 riot had ruined the city's economy and reputation. Detroit was obviously no closer to solving its racial wars than it had ever been. By the end of the 1970s, 1/3 of Detroiters fell below the poverty line. People were desperate. Around that time, the drug trade became particularly attractive because it was, in many ways, a golden economic opportunity. The merchandise was easy to come by and easy to sell. The drug epidemic of the 1980s brought Detroit's poor neighborhoods to an all-time low. There were crack houses everywhere. Whole apartment blocks were converted to the drug trade at one point. Those were devastating years, and the effects, like a long ripple in a pond, are still being seen.
They got a slang in the black community. They call it the land of the haters and gators. You know what I'm saying? Haters, because everybody is in competition with each other and they're speaking falsehood and they're speaking negativity against each other, so nobody's really on the positive level. Gators, because that represents a little bit of money, because you got to have some, gators, you got to have a little money to pay for some gators. The thing is, who did you hate on to get the money to pay for your gators?
Dope is only for hustling tight ninjas, distributed throughout the streets for the fiends. If you're not careful, then it just might get you. Put an end to all your dreams.
It ain't quite the same as that first dosage. Exposed to the most explosive crew on the face of this earth's surface, but few will grow discouraged to pursue the music. Like street distribution, let's move shit and watch them lose it.
You can't deny the way this makes you feel inside. You wanna listen to it over and over and take a ride and see it. Worth it is, yes, no promiscuous effects. Just a better look at what's coming to you in half steps. Exceed the Frank and stop walking the park. Oddball, LeBron, Oz, and John Anatomy for season 4. You about to be addicted, specifically Michael's terrific. Into some counseling, shave your hair off and get with it. Needle be dripping in the city of Westwick.
I guess the thing that really strikes me more than anything else is how it really hasn't changed in all those years. It has not changed. There's no new housing anywhere. There's no new community centers. There's no new parks. The roads are just as rough now that they've always been. And I'm just shocked by that it could stay the same all this time. That's a thing I think we found out about Detroit.
What you see on the outside isn't necessarily what happened, but it's evidence that something tragic has happened in the neighborhood. What you have here is a very, very sad story, and one that parallels a lot of similar stories throughout the nation.
Reed, this is one of these houses that's left from the apparent urban flight or white flight of the 60s. And as you drive around sections of Detroit, it's literally covered with places like this that are rotten. It's been 40 years. I don't know, you know, look at that, the place falling apart. 40 years worth of standing here, and that's what we have. Well, you'd think that, I mean, in a 40-year period of time, you'd think somebody would have bought these places up, fixed them up, done something with them, but they're still standing. And we've only been around the block 3 times here, but there's probably 30 of these things in similar or worse condition. Well, and you know, you just wonder what's going to happen in the future with things like this.
The place really needs some change.
We've been all over Detroit, and here we are right now in downtown Detroit. This is not out in the periphery. This is right downtown. And we got burned out buildings, apartment buildings that have been burned out, glass busted, abandoned. And if you look across the street, there's one here, there's one to my right. And I've never seen anything like this before. I don't know how many cities would have this, but we see a preponderance of this kind of thing here. If I was going to refurbish this area, I simply wouldn't know where to start. I guess you start from the ground and work up, but even the ground is covered with debris. This is truly what they call urban inner city blight right here.
Now Detroit faces its greatest challenge as its auto industry is threatened.
Detroit is just unbelievable right now. It is unbelievable. The housing situation is probably among the worst in the United States. I mean, the average price of a home is so far below the American average that it doesn't even seem like it's in America. The unemployment is terrible. There's just no jobs available. The future doesn't look good because a lot of Detroit is based on auto manufacturing, and the car manufacturers face a very bleak future.
You know, you walk around wondering how on earth Detroit could be changed, and who would change it? Who could change it? Who would bring the businesses back and make sure there are enough jobs? Who would restore or build new apartments, offices, and everything else the city needs? Who would finally forge a deep and lasting harmony between African Americans and whites? Who indeed? Is it going to be the movie stars, the rock stars, the billionaires, the politicians? We don't think so. So who will it be?